Lady Bucketeers. Welcome to the bucket courses on this beautiful first day of autumn. So good to see you all here. I'm Joanne Bundy, and I want to remind you to take a moment to check your cell phone to be sure that it's silenced and turn on the tea coil. Well, this morning we are in the second class of Dan Week's course on creativity, a lifelong journey. And I'm happy to turn it over to Dan right away this morning. He will be talking about what self-taught artists know. I can't wait to find out. So here's Dan Weeks.
Can everybody hear me? All right. Let me know if I talk too softly. Well, thanks for coming to class number 2. I don't know about you all, but I had a wonderful time last week. You folks are great fun, and very participative, and I learned, so you had some great insights about Carl Schrag's work, and I learned some things and saw some things thanks to your comments that I hadn't seen before. Especially I remember somebody saying how the stars had the same lines around them that his eyes did in his self-portrait. I never noticed that before. Well, I got this past week some great questions from folks, and I wanted to that's my email address on the bottom. If there's anything that comes up that we don't get a chance to talk about during the comments at the end and the discussion at the end, or you have any questions of me, or you have anything that you'd like me to address in the next class, feel free to send me an email. It's danwweeks@gmail.com. There's 2 W's in there, Dan W. Weeks. By all means, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to get them. Joanne was kind enough to send me a couple of questions that a couple of you had mentioned last week, and they're excellent questions. One was, what part does the subconscious play in creativity? And the other one was, what makes creative people tick? Yes, we're all creative, but what draws it out? In other words, is there such a thing as creativity on demand, or is it something that needs to come and visit us? So I think these are great questions. We're going to talk, I'm going to talk about a bunch of artists today, many more last week. We really talked about 1 and then brought in 2 at the end. I'm going to talk about 6 or 7 or 8 today, so you're going to see lots more work. But I think about both of those questions, but particularly the first as we go through it and go through these folks' work and say, what are some of the things that we talked about last week, and are we seeing some of the same themes this week? And what are the differences? What are the similarities? First, I thought I'd go over a bit of the learnings that we got from Carl last time. And is George Drake here today? George, would you mind repeating that wonderful definition of creativity that you mentioned at the end? You said, as a historian, I found that, and you'll...
What I said, can you hear me, folks?
Yes.
What I said was that, from the point of view of this history, oftentimes creativity, a creative interpretation, is when you bring 2 things that seemingly are separate, part of 2 different things, and then they're juxtaposed because you see their relationship. That's kind of an aha moment in historical research. And if you can do that with a major theme, you've got a great book.
Yes. And a great discovery. Someone just asked me if I could repeat that, so I'm going to see if I can remember it. George said in history, when you often get a creative interpretation of history is when 2 things are juxtaposed that don't seem to have anything to do with one another. Correct me again if I'm mangling this. And then when you put them together, you see what some of the similarities are, and you come up with a new interpretation.
I can give you an example.
Yes.
Lynn White is a historian of the Middle Ages. Sorry to do this, folks. The so-called stirrup theory of feudalism. When the saddle and stirrup were developed, you then could actually fight on horseback. You couldn't. Before that, you rode up to battle, got off the horse, because if you started fighting, you'd fall off the horse. But with the invention of the stirrup, you have the basis for medieval feudalism. That's the kind of juxtaposition I'm talking about.
Yeah. So anyway, we talked about paradox and embracing your paradox, and because when something comes out of you, you may seem to be going in 2 different directions, but somewhere deep inside, those 2 lines cross. And the paradox is unified. There's some single cause because you're one person. And artists know to pay attention to those things and not to block out one and go with the other. The rest of these quotes are from Carl Schrock. The life comes before the work. The life sort of precedes the work, it shapes the work, it informs the work, and it's a great way to begin to understand the work of an artist is to know them or know something about them. He also talked about being a sleepwalker. He said, sometimes he painted a self-portrait where he was sleepwalking. He said, sometimes I paint like I'm not really there. These things seem to be sort of happening. I'm not quite awake to them. I really don't know what's going on. And he also said that art, a person's creative work is influenced by all you've thought and felt your whole life. And from some of the things that people were seeing in his paintings here, they may not have been things that Carl was consciously thinking of when he was painting them or intended to be a part of the painting, but nonetheless, they came out. And he also said, probably in recognition of that the viewer must to some degree become the painter, because the viewer will sometimes see things that an artist might not have been conscious that they put in there, but are clearly there. Think about that as we see some of the stuff that we're about to see today. Or the viewer may see something that they needed to see, that the artist didn't intend, but that makes sense to the viewer, and we learn something even perhaps different from what the artist consciously intended the painting to be about. And finally, he talked about style coming by itself, that you can't make your own style. It's like your handwriting. It is the way it is. You can't alter it. Although you may try to work in many different media and do many different things, it all bears the stamp of the creator, whether you want it to or not. And we saw afterwards, when we studied, we looked at some of the work of the piano builder and the canoe builder, that even when they were trying to do an exact replica of something, it bore their own stamp. So today I thought it might be interesting if we, it's still kind of mysterious though, you know, where that all comes from. And I thought today it might be kind of interesting to look at the work of artists who are all self-taught in their medium. These people were ordinary people like the rest of us. One of them was a printer, one of them was a data processing engineer, one of them was a PE teacher, one of them was a fiber artist, but she worked as a fiber artist, but she was trained as a painter. She completely left the medium that she was taught in. Another one was a self-taught Missouri hick, her words, not mine. But all of these people at some point, something happened and they became artists, and not only artists, but really, really good professional artists that won a lot of recognition. So what might they know about the leap from being something else to being a creative person who can produce creative work? So we're going to go through, we're going to go ripping through 6 artists today, and feel free to ask questions if I'm not making something clear, or if you need some more information, by all means ask. Because we're going to look at so many artists, I probably won't stop quite as often today to ask questions. But while we go through it, notice any themes or commonalities between these folks' work that you see. Notice anything that seems to resonate with any of these things that we've looked at before. And notice any differences. You know, it's sort of a study in theme and variations, or compare and contrast. What's alike about these artists, what's different about these artists, and what can it tell us about creativity? Feel free to note those things down or just remember them, because I hope to have a similarly, you know, several minutes of discussion at the end where I'd love to hear your perceptions of this. The first artist we're going to talk about is this guy. His name is Galen Carpenter. He's the former printing press operator. He is now one of the country's premier woodworkers. He turns, using a wood lathe, segmented bowls. Which means a wood lathe is something, does everybody know what a wood lathe is? Okay, I don't have to explain. Anyway, he most of the time he turns solid blocks of wood on a wood lathe, but he has all kinds of exotic wood boards there stacked behind him, and he takes them and he cuts them up in very precise angles into very precise segments, and he glues them all together, and then he turns what he's glued together. So they have lots of different grain in them, as you'll see. And I had 3 days with him. He lives in Sedona, Arizona, and as I do with most people. And it was the end of the 3rd day. In fact, it was the beginning of the 4th day. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I had a plane to catch at 6, and it was a 2-hour drive away. And I'm still fascinated by this guy, and still talking to him, and still asking, how do you do this? And I thought, wait a minute, I know why I'm doing this. Why is he staying up until 2 o'clock in the morning talking to me? And so I asked him, I said, Galen, why are you doing this? And he said, and he was very passionate, very engaged, and he said, because no one has ever asked me these kinds of questions before. And he said, I'm learning things about myself as an artist that I've never realized before. Things that I've not been conscious of, which now I see. And knowing those things is going to make me a better artist. And that was an aha moment for me, because I realized a lot of our education, no matter what we do, is spent teaching us tools, techniques, and precedents. But he was saying that he was getting an education in his own process, and that was valuable to him. And I thought, that's the first time I've heard that. And maybe there's something that we're missing here when we're trying to teach ourselves how to be creative. And about half, by the way, about half of the people that I interviewed, and my interviews were of people, as I said about the silversmith last week, that I really went on a national search, and I would contact organizations and say, you know, there's an association for everything. There are associations of woodturners, there are associations of curators of various types of media, and I would say, you know, who's the best, and how do I get in touch with them and send you the stuff? So these were all the best artists I could find. About half of them were completely self-taught. When judged by that criteria. Half of them had some sort of artistic education. So today we're going to look at the half, mostly, that were self-taught. So this is one of Galen's pieces. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. And you can see the segments of wood that he's cut and glued together and then turned. And when I looked at it, I thought, this has all of the form. What happened? Come back. That's not good. Anyway, I was saying that I thought this has all of the formal refinement of blown glass or fine ceramics or classical pottery. And so the first thing I asked him was, well, where do you find these beautiful curves? And we'll wait. Okay, there we go. You're the hero of the hour. Now, nobody breathe. And we'll be good. You ready? It's working. Okay. So I asked him, where do you get these beautiful curves? And he said, and it was particularly, I guess we'll wait till everybody's ready. You all set?
Unless he sits down.
Okay, all right, thank you. And so I was asking about the forms of these vessels, and he said, for the most part, simple is beautiful. I like real strong forms. So I thought these have got to be historical. I pictured him pouring through books of, you know, classical pottery and so on, and I said, so where do you get these shapes? And he looked at me and he said, I probably shouldn't tell you. And we were sitting in his shop was in his garage, and he took a fan belt, a car fan belt off the wall, and he walked out into the beautiful Arizona sunshine, and he held up the fan belt to the sun, and he twisted it. And he was looking not at the belt, but at the shadow that the belt cast on the concrete driveway. And he said, well, there's a pretty good bowl right there. Then he would angle it, he'd stretch it a little bit, and he said, now there's a long neck bowl. And he said, some days I sit out here all morning, and when I get a shape I like, I take a piece of chalk and I draw it on the driveway, and then I go on and do another one. And he said, if I can get a shape down, technically I can turn it. But if I alter it just a little bit in the course of turning it, it changes the character of the whole bowl. That's what he means by a long neck bowl. Does anybody know what that material is that goes up the... Anybody tell what that is? That's OSB, Oriented Strand Board. It is widely used as a replacement for plywood. It's a bunch of wood chips that are glued together under pressure. You've seen them on houses when they board up windows. Everybody said, all the expert turners says it can't be turned. It flies apart. It disintegrates. You can't turn it. He found a way to do it because he was self-taught. He said, I've never had a design class in my life, but I can see things most people don't. Technically, if I can get a shape on paper, I can make it. He's never had a wood turning class either, ever. He said, most turners have taken lessons I learned by doing. And according to the experts, he does it all wrong. He uses, there are lots of wood turning chisels with all different kinds of shapes, and he uses them in ways that you shouldn't use them. He holds them in ways that you shouldn't hold them. He makes contact with the wood in ways that you shouldn't make contact with the wood, and as a result, he can do things like this. And he also turns all kinds of other stuff that can't be turned, including palm root. That's the root of a palm tree. Okay, after it goes into the soil, those are all the little roots that you see in cross section. And elk antler. That's what the rim is. Can anybody tell what this bowl is made out of? Pine cones. That's the end of a pine cone. He's cut them all in a what he did was he soaked them in epoxy. He waited till the epoxy cured, so now they're solid. They're not feathering, flying away. He cut them in very, very precise angled segments. He glued them all together, and then he laminated some wood on the top and on the bottom, and he made one monolithic piece of block, and he turned it. No one has ever turned a pine cone before, and he had to invent the method of doing it. But he said, and all because he was ignorant. You know, he said, I didn't know this. He grew up in rural Kansas, and he said, so he said he never come in contact with any other artists or any other wood turners. And he said later, now I shelter myself from other people's work. He said, if you're not looking to other people for ideas, you go through your own natural evolution. You start working with ideas and developing them and trying different variations on them and deciding what works and what doesn't. And he says if you're exposed to a lot of other influences, you tend to be looking outward instead of looking inward. He learned about art gradually. First as a printer, he was a printing press operator, and he said, there's where I really learned about color and how color works and how color interacts. And then as a restorer of fine antique furniture, he said people would bring pieces into his shop, and he said, that's where I learned about form and line and composition and how things come together. He said, I started turning these bowls just for therapy, for a diversion. People started offering me money for them. I found it hard to believe. Then the Wichita Art Museum discovered me. They were the ones that told me these things were vessels. I called them bowls. I was right off the turnip truck. There's another one. He leaves hollowing his pieces for last and often shaves the vessel to 1/8 of an inch thick. And he says, hollowing, you're running blind. Because he has to, all the material has to come, he has to put the tool that cuts the wood through the hole. And all the material has to come out of that hole. And of course he can't see where the tool is resting. So I said, how do you do that? He says, well, sometimes, as here, I'm working through a hole the size of my little finger. I run by feel and by sound, he says. You develop a tone and hold it. If he's a tad off key, he ends up slicing a half-completed bowl in half, and he says the results make great frisbees. But they ruin tens of hours of work, because I mean, with a lot of these segmented things, he's had to find the material, he's had to soak the pine cones, he's had to find them all that are just the right size, he's had to wait till the epoxy cures, he has to cut them all, then he has to put them all together, then laminate the other things on, then he turns the outside, and then, at the very, very last, he turns the inside, and one slip of the hand, and it's worthless. And I said, why don't you just leave them solid? And he said, well, I could, but I make them to be felt and picked up and touched and held. And people expect a certain form to weigh a certain amount. And he said, if it's too heavy, it doesn't feel right. If it's eggshell thin, it doesn't have the heft that you expect. And he says, I leave a little bit of beef in the base so they'll sit better in balance in your hand. He works a lot by feel, not just when he's doing inside, but when he's turning the outside. He said he'll have the tool in one hand and he'll rest his fingers on the piece in the other as it turns. And he said, I can just feel how much I'm taking off. And he said, when it feels right, it is right. He says, the feel of it is more accurate to me than looking at it. And he said, people come into my shop with their hands behind their back. They were trying to physically restrain themselves from touching. But he says, I tell them to go ahead. The best designs are invariably the ones people want to hold. And he says that's how he tells, yep, that's a successful design. Everybody who's come in runs over to that one and wants to pick it up. So, what allowed him to do what he does, as far as I can see, first of all, is ignorance. There was no one around to say, no, don't hold it that way, don't do that, no, you can't turn that, this material won't work, this will dull your chisel. And there was also no one to tell him that his intuition, his idea, was wrong. So he just worked at it by trial and error. And so it seemed to me that if you're focused inward, you'll teach yourself to some degree, but you've got to trust that what you're interested in doing is worth following. And if there's nobody to say no, that can happen. Okay, here's another artist, Randy DiMercato. Randy is originally from Jamaica, came to this country when he was in his early 20s and worked as a data processing engineer for a major New York hospital for a career. Did very well, retired early, and he had met some doctors at the hospital who grew bonsai trees. And so he said, I think I'd like to grow bonsai trees. So he started growing bonsai trees, and he started growing prize-winning, whoop-de-doo, hot dog bonsai trees that were winning competitions. And he said, I'm just sitting these on a regular table like this. They deserve a nicer table. I'm going to find me a traditional Chinese table. But he couldn't. They weren't made anymore. So he started doing a bunch of research and books, and he found a bunch of drawings of Chinese table and said, I think I'll build myself a real Chinese table. So, having never done any woodwork before, he built this. A stand for his bonsai trees, and all of the elements, that's called a horse's hoof, foot, and those are called cloud lift stretchers because they kind of look like clouds. He just figured out how to do it, and he did it. And then he said, well, that turned out pretty well. I think I'll do something a little bigger. So he built this console table, and finally, sort of coup de grace, he said, I wonder what the most complicated piece of Chinese furniture is. And he decided it was this horseshoe armchair. There's not a fastener in that piece. It's all put together with you've heard the term Chinese puzzle, these very intricate interlocking joints. And he said, well, I could find books that showed the joint, but they didn't show me how to put it together. I had to figure that out for myself. And I said, well, you had never done any woodworking before, and you'd never studied art before or anything. How did you do this? And he said, this chair is made out of one board because it's cherry and all the grain matches. And so he said, I bought one board that had enough wood in it to make the chair, but no more. And if I made a mistake, I had to start all over again, or I'd have a chair which looked like a zebra. It had two different colors to it. So he said, I decided I'd start with the easiest looking piece and go on from there. And that's what he did. And listen to what he said about it. He said working, even though it was very complicated, he said, working on it was very calming to me. I started with the simplest piece, and one thing led to another. I was doing it, but I was not conscious of doing it. I'd never studied Zen, but that's the way it felt. In Chinese philosophy, everything integrates to create a sense of calm. If I lost that sense, I sharpened tools for a while. The Chinese were in no rush. Why should they be? I'd work on the pieces until they felt right. I didn't look at them. I'd run my hand over them. The proportions are so subtle you can feel them before you can see them. Then when you put them all together, everything looks right. And he took me into his shop, and I've been in the shops of, master woodworkers like Rod Regier, who have all kinds of, expensive English chisels and so on. And his chisels were just, Walgreens chisels. I mean, and they weren't sharpened right. They were sharpened, the bevel was on the wrong side, and it was just. I grew up with a woodworker. I know how this stuff is supposed to look, but he just figured it out as he went along. And he seemed to be saying that it was almost the mindset, the state of mind that produced the work rather than the series of technical steps. And that if he lost that sense of calm confidence in what he was doing, he knew it was time to stop because he was going to make a mistake. Another artist. This is the artist who was trained as an artist. She's British. She grew up in an artistic family, and she was trained in watercolors. And she won some very prestigious watercolor competitions when she was still in grade school. But when she grew up, she decided that, that there was something missing in painting, and that was the sense of depth and texture that a real landscape has, the way the light hits things and reflects differently off differently angled surfaces, and there's sort of a depth that recedes. And she said, you know, I had the idea that maybe I could create that with fabric. And so she tried cutting fabric in very small pieces and sewing it all together, but the fabric was so, the pieces were so small they just fall apart into threads. So she couldn't do it. And so she kept thinking about it, and finally she realized, well, if I can find a bonding agent that I can coat the back of the fabric with, then it will hold these little pieces of fabric together, I can cut them out, and then I can bond them together. So that's what she did. And that is one of the results. That's not a painting. Every line and piece of color you see there is a separate piece of fabric. So all of those pieces of grass, all of the stamen and the pistils and the flowers, all of the spines, the cacti, that's all fabric. She has had people walk up to it and say, I really like your painting. And they're standing this close to it. And she says, that's fiber. And they don't believe her. And she says, touch it. It's truly amazing. As far as she knows, she's the only person who does this kind of work. And this is a close-up that it's a little grainy, but I wanted to take it so you can see how it works. She's putting a petal on a flower, and they all layer together, and then she has an iron. She says, I get them from people's grandmothers, you know, before the steam irons that are just flat on the bottom, so she can bond them together. Here's another piece. I'm sorry I can't show you one of these in person because it's really the shimmering texture of these things that's amazing. And in different times of day and under different lights and with different angles, they look different. They really come alive. They kind of dance. And she chooses fabrics not only for their color, but for their sheen and for their nap. And she'll run the nap different ways so that you'll get the sense of depth. And she says, well, that's the way real landscapes are. They have all different textures, and paint can't do that. That's what I wanted to do. Here's another example. All of those veins are separate pieces of fabric. And here's what she had to say about her process. And think about what you just heard from Randy DeMercado. She said, I work in a state of calm. It's very calming to look out at the water, and the changing light, to spend time in the garden, which is where she got the inspiration for a lot of her pieces. She said, when the art is going well, it's flowing out of me. Sometimes you need to stop and make decisions. But if you make all your decisions consciously, it can become too halting. The process should have a movement to it that makes the results almost inevitable. I was talking to a wood carver. He worked in North Carolina, and he did carving to replicate the carving on some 18th century houses down there. He said, yeah, when they renovated them in the 19th century, the first thing they did was rip all this frippery off, and he said now they wanted to replace it. And when I watched him carve, he was zipping right along. I mean, wood was flying, chips were flying, he was making big movements with the chisel. And I said, you know, aren't you afraid you'll make a mistake? And he said, these guys in the 18th century, they were paid by the flower. He said, they were not paid to buff and sand and everything into a complete dead surface. He said, they had to work fast. And he said, the result is, you know, you have this, I mean, Chinese painting is done this way very quickly. You have this sense of movement, you have the, you know, the pressure on the tool, it all sort of comes through. He says nowadays when people try and restore these things, they make mincing little cuts because they're afraid they're going to make a mistake, and then they sand everything and it just looks dead. He said this is the way it's supposed to look. I've heard that from several lines. Okay, this is the retired PE teacher. Her name is Dottie Moore. She lives in the very near the Blue Hill Mountains, Vizad, yeah. And she incorporates the Blue Ridge Mountains vistas and colors and layers into her work. She makes art books, okay. And like the other artists we've talked about, she also invented techniques in order to achieve her vision. She folds material, she tears it, she folds it back on itself, wrinkles it, cuts it, peels it, not things that you see in traditional quilts. And most unconventionally of all, she uses a sewing machine. Most quilters, you know, traditional quilters, sewing machines anathema, but she uses a sewing machine, but she uses it freehand. She puts the fabric underneath, she turns off, turns off the little traction things that, I don't know what they're called, what do they call it? The feed, thank you, that feeds the material through, and then she moves the material freehand to achieve what you want. So some of these things are different pieces of fabric, obviously, but a lot of the details, the leaves, the branches, the texture in the bark is achieved by stitchery. And she moves around. She says, it's kind of funny, Bernina is her sponsor, and they sent her the most expensive computerized sewing machine, a brand new one every year, and she says, I turn all of that stuff off, and all I use is something. You find it in a treadle singer machine. But anyway, she also describes working in a flow state to the point that she's often surprised by the quilt that results. And sometimes I found she had a whole bunch of these hung around her studio, and I was walking around talking to her about it, and sometimes she would seem to be, to me anyway, to be entirely unaware of what she'd created. Here, for example, is a work she entitled Dreams. Now, looking at the shape, the light shape there, does that resemble anything to anybody? Exactly, a bed. I said, well, yeah, there's a bed. And she said, really? That never occurred to me before. Isn't that interesting? Oh my goodness, you're right. And she had this for years. Then another piece, which I don't have a picture of, which was even more dramatic to me, she had quilted a tree. And it was one of these weeping trees where the branches go up and then they come down. And it was shaped kind of like a heart because the branches went up and they came down. And on one side of the tree, the branches and the leaves were red. And on the other side, the branches and the leaves were blue. And it was a beautiful piece. And I said, oh, that tree looks like a heart. Look, there are the arteries and there are the veins. And she looked like she'd been hit by a hand. She literally grabbed my arm and staggered backwards and said, oh my goodness. Oh, and she was almost speechless. And I said, what? And she said, I made that for a friend who was recovering from a massive heart attack. I'd never seen anything in it but a tree. And she has this wonderful southern accent. She said, oh, that gives me chills. But I wasn't always jetting around the country talking to artists. I was the associate editor of this magazine here, produced by the Better Homes and Gardens people. It's a decorating magazine. What is known in the industry as design porn, because if you just look at the pictures, you don't read them. So there were not a lot of artists in these magazines. But so I had to, when I wasn't writing these art stories that I had talked them into letting me do, I had to interview people about interior decorating. And I had no background in interior decorating. I mean, most of my fellow staff people, yeah, Randy says, my wife says, you still don't. Most of my fellow staff, we just lost our image there again. But we got it back again. Most of my fellow staff people were double major home ec and journalism majors from ISU, and they could look at a picture of a room like this one, and they could just start rattling. I mean, they just sit down and they start. The keys would fly like chiclets. You know, they were saying, well, you know, this person picked up the red in the table, and they started from there and did that. And they could make up a whole story that probably wasn't true, but sounded good, and explain some principles of interior design. But I didn't know that, so I had to actually call up the homeowner and say, what are you doing here? And it wasn't always easy. I called the woman who had, this is a guest bedroom in her house, and it's where her granddaughter stays when she comes to visit. And this was very early in my career, so I kind of looked at it and thought, oh my gosh, I don't even know the names for these things. What do I start talking about? I thought the wall color. That seems to be pretty, and so I said, well, where did you come up with that beautiful rose color? And she said, I don't know, I just kind of like it. Well, I had, you know, we used to call it's kind of like the text was the mortar between the bricks of images. You know, they would give you a box and you had to fill it. You know, no matter how much or how little there was to say about what you were looking at, that was your job. And they'd say, well, we need some gray in there. So come up with some text. You know, come up with some. So, but that wasn't going to fill the box. I just kind of liked it. So I said, well, why did you like it? And she said, I don't know. It just gives me a really calm, peaceful, warm feeling. Well, that still wasn't going to fill the box. So out of desperation, I don't know why I asked this, I said, well, what's the earliest association, what's your earliest memory of that color? And suddenly she got really quiet. And then she started to cry. And I thought, oh my goodness, what have I done? This nice lady. And she said, no, that's all right, that's all right. She says, I just remember that when I stayed with my grandmother for 2 weeks every summer, that was the color of my room. She said, I haven't realized that until now. And she said, thank you for asking, because now I know why I did it. So I started to think, after interviewing all these people, and interviewing this gal who had no claims to being an artist, yet still, out of the subconscious it came, along with the veins and the arteries and the bed and everything else. I thought, what if artists are people who, without even knowing it, have found a way to access their subconscious to create things of beauty and meaning for the rest of us? And what if we all could do this? But artists is that's their job. That's what they do. And we stumble into it occasionally, like this gal did. But what if artists do it all the time? And what if we learn, if we could look at this work and learn about how this happens, if it's helpful to them, maybe it could be helpful to us in some way as well. So with those thoughts in mind, I set off to interview my next artist. And the next artist on my docket was, by fiat of my editor, the silversmith. She said, you know, everybody's got silverware, Dan. You know, and they like their silverware, these people in traditional homes. So find the best silversmith in the country. So I went through my usual routine of going around, and I saw a lot of good stuff. A lot of good photography came in. There was a lot of flatware. There was a little bit of jewelry. There were some academic medallions and so on and so forth. But it all looked reasonably similar. And then I saw these. Those are salad servers made in the form of Chinese maple leaves. And they were so stunningly designed and crafted that I thought, this artist must be a master, long apprentice to masters. And I expected to find somebody with some sort of European or Scandinavian accent. But to my amazement, the artist was this woman. She was in her early 30s then. Her name is Robin Nichols. She grew up on her grandmother's farm in rural Missouri and called herself a self-taught Missouri hick. She spoke with an Ozark twang, and she seemed to be as amazed as I was as what she had been able to do with silver. And I said, well, how did this happen? And she said, well, I was the first girl in my shop class. She said, we were supposed to be building mailboxes. And after I learned how to weld, I persuaded them to let me make sculpture. After that, somehow or other, I managed to turn every class into an art class. When I got to high school, the teachers would ask a question and all these hands would go up, and I'd say, how do they know all this stuff? And I realized then that all I learned was art, so that I'd better be an artist. That's all I really wanted to do. More salad servers. Does anybody know what these are in the shape of?
Lily pads.
I'm sorry?
Lily pads.
They look like lily pads. They're nasturtium leaves, very close. They look like lily pads. But they're nasturtium leaves. And I said, why did you make these in the shape of nasturtium? She said, well, I love nasturtium leaves in salad. But not only has she taken the form of the leaf, but look what she's done with the stems. I mean, that's completely inventive. All of that, I mean, the stem, you can see there's some nasturtium leaves right there, and the stems don't look like that. But in order to achieve a handle, she came up with these beautiful, beautiful lines. And she said, I think my style, the reason my style is so strong, echoes of Galen Carpenter again here, is that I didn't know what was impossible. At first, I didn't even know what tools were used for what. A lot of things I figured out as I went along. She wasn't entirely self-taught. She has a BFA from the Kansas City Art Institute. But when she got the BFA from the Kansas City Art Institute, they didn't have a metalsmithing program. So she did what she did in junior high school. She talked them into letting her do metalsmithing, and they said, well, if you want to read up on it, we'll get you some tools. You read up on it and go to the studio and make stuff, and we'll give you a grade. So essentially, she taught herself. And she said, I tried all kinds of ancient techniques that nobody uses anymore because they're far too labor intensive. Repoussé is one of them, where you work on the back of the piece and to create those veins on the front. This is the handle of a calla lily letter opener, photographed against the real thing. She said this design came from looking at a fragile calabash and wanting to hold it. The function came afterward. She said, I'm not here to repeat nature. I borrow from it. The challenge is to transform rigid metal into something flowing and alive as it sits in front of you. Sound familiar? This is a Morning Glory napkin ring, and this photo is not the best, but you can see there's the Morning Glory blossom right here, and the leaves there, and they wrap around, the stems wrap around the napkin. And she said, sometimes I take the most fragile thing from nature that I can think of, and I strengthen it. I give it stability and permanence by rendering it in silver. Off it goes again. This is the did it go out here? I guess we're going to take a break.
Thank you for taking your chairs, ladies and gentlemen. Now sorry about the technical problems, but we don't need any more slides. So Dan is going to go on with the lecture. I'm so happy to turn this back to the editor of the Iowan magazine, and to the man who has absolutely the best job in the world, Dan Weeks.
Thanks, Joanne. Well, we're lucky. We lost our video, but fortunately, I was on the last photographic slide. This is typically when I like to have the discussion section anyway. So I had some text slides, but you haven't missed. You've only missed one. You've only missed one of the photographs, and so we'll just take it from here. Not a problem. So I asked. This is Robin Nichols, right, the silversmith, and I asked her. You know, what she's trying to do with her work. And she says, well, in the form of a piece, I try to capture a gesture of nature. A leaf is breathing. It's a breathing, growing thing. I want to see that in my work. Or maybe that the wind is going to catch it and it's going to curl. At first, a piece looks like a frozen moment, like a photograph. But as you turn it, the reflections make it seem to move. That's what she said about rendering. And I said, why are all of your pieces about natural subjects? And she said, well, you know, I grew up on a farm with my grandmother, and there weren't a lot of kids around. And my grandmother had a big garden, and she also had a woodland, and I would spend a lot of time out there. Oh, sorry, not loud enough? Okay, thank you. She said, I'd spend a lot of time in my grandmother's garden and out in the woods, and you know, I feel at home in nature. That's really what I grew up. Those were my friends, were the plants. And that still didn't seem to quite get to it, because she had this tremendous passion for, you know, she'd say, this leaf is going to die, but it's so beautiful. I can't bear for it to die. But if I make it in silver, then it will live forever. Then I can have it and I can hold it. And she said, when I discovered silversmithing, it was as though someone said, here are the means to transform something you love that's ephemeral into something that you can always have with you and you can hold. And again, I asked her why. You know, this is the 2-year-old version of the interview. You know, they just keep saying, you can say, why this, Dad? And you can tell them, and then they'll say, why? And then so that's a little bit more difficult to answer. And then, well, but 3 whys get you to metaphysics. I mean, you know, no matter where you start. So I just asked, why again? Why do you want to preserve nature? Why do you want to make it permanent? And she told me a story, and I still get chills when I tell it. She said, when I was little and I'd go out in the woods for hours at a time, she said, I don't tell anybody this, nobody knows this, except my grandmother, but she says, I think I can trust you. She said, the woods fairies. The woods fairies. The woods fairies taught me about how plants grow, and how insects work, and how they relate together. And she taught me how they move, and how the wind blows their seeds and plants them somewhere else, and how the birds eat their seeds. The woods fairies taught me this. And she said, also nature is a matter of life and death. She said, nature saved my life once. And I said, would you be willing to tell me that story? And she said, I was in danger. I knew I was in danger from some people who were going to come to the farm. And I didn't ask any details, but she said, so I knew I had to hide. She's a little girl. She said, I ran out into the barnyard where the ground was soft, and I got a shovel out of the barn, and I dug a little depression in the ground. She said it got hard pretty quickly, so I couldn't go very deeply. That was big enough to hold me. And she said, I lay down in that depression, and I pulled the straw that was lying around the ground on top of me. And she said, and the chickens, who had been roosting and pecking all around the barnyard, all came and roosted on top of the hay and hid her until the danger was gone. And she said, when they got off me, I knew it was safe to come out. I've said before, I'm the son of a physicist, right? I believe in the scientific method. I believe in proof. I believe in rationalism and skepticism. But she had no reason to tell me anything that she didn't believe was true. It certainly wasn't going to improve her credibility to tell me stories like this. I have no reason to doubt what she told me. And in fact, I have no other explanation for the fact that a little girl from rural Missouri did work that beggared description and stood out head and shoulders above all of the other silversmiths that I looked at. She was one very, very motivated person. She had a vision, she had something that she needed to do for her own reasons, and that's why she did it. So, let's see. Does it advance now? Yes, it does. Okay. So those are the artists we were going to look at today. And what I wanted to ask you is, what themes have these artists surfaced? What things do you see that they've done that they have in common? Anybody see anything running through any of these?
But nobody told them it was impossible.
Nobody told them it was impossible. Exactly. Yes. Anything else?
They used uncommon things.
They used uncommon things. They didn't work with traditional materials. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
It seems like they enjoyed solving problems.
Yes. They were inventors. If they ran into a problem, they figured out how to do it rather than, researched it. They came up with their own way, whether that was using a fan belt to make compound curves or whether it was inventing silversmithing techniques or using wood turning things differently. Yes?
The sense of touch, how the feeling of the wood in the various pieces.
Yeah.
That they knew it was exactly right, either on the lathe or the furniture maker.
Yes, yes, yes.
Even the person doing the quilting, how she was moving.
Right, yeah. It seemed like whatever they were doing, to repeat the comment, the sense of touch, the fact that these people seemed to work directly with the materials, not through a visual or a spoken language, but they actually felt the materials coming together. That's I hadn't thought of that before. Yes?
Isn't there a contact with nature in each of these, but in different ways?
Yes, there certainly is. Yeah. Isn't there a contact, sorry, I keep forgetting to do that. Just jump up and wave that question mark. Isn't there a contact with nature, something to do with nature present in each of these people's work? Yes, there is. Anything else anybody notice? These are all great, yes.
A sense of calm while they were working.
Yeah, this sort of sense of calm, this meditative state that they were in while they were working. Amanda, the fiber artist, saying, you can't stop too often, or the work gets jittery. You have to have that sense of flow, or your stopping places will be the stopping and starting. You'll see that in the work. And the wood carver saying, you've got to keep the follow through is important. Anything else? Yeah.
They didn't seem to be aware they were accessing their subconscious.
That's very true. They didn't seem to be aware that they were accessing their self-conscious. The sleep? Yeah. Subconscious. Did I say self-conscious? Yeah. Maybe they knew they were accessing their self-consciousness, but their subconscious. Yeah, that was something that universally I found that whenever I talked to these people and I made observations that seemed to be fairly literal, like that tree looks like a heart, oftentimes they had no knowledge that they were making that connection. But they recognized it. As soon as I said it, they said, of course, and they sometimes had fairly emotional responses to it, saying, yeah, that's what that's all about. Wow, that's what motivated me to do that. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Isn't that what art is all about?
Well, that's what we're here to try. Isn't that what art is all about?
What you see and what you feel is personal to the viewer as well as to the creator.
What you see and feel is personal to the viewer as well as to the creator. Isn't that what art is all about? All excellent, excellent observations. Anything else? Yes?
You mentioned that they work internally, but it seems to me that none of these artists are interrupted while they're working. I know you were there for 3 days, but
I was a big interruption. You're costing me a lot of money, Dan.
I don't think they walked around with cell phones. They were checking their stock prices. They were into what they were doing, and
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think
their ability to focus must be very unusual.
yes. The comment was that these artists must have found ways to work without interruption, and they must have incredibly focused people. And I think you're right. I asked Carl Schrag if he'd paint while I was there, and he said I'm not a performer. So he wouldn't paint for me, and I didn't blame him. But anything, yeah.
But Carl Frogren, they all had either caregivers or someone else, I would guess, who took care of.
I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did. That's the comment was that they all had caregivers or someone else to check their stock prices and answer their phone and make their meals and make their beds, and I'm sure they did. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah. No, you.
Okay, my question is, now you've also certainly met with people who were trained and schooled and had all the benefits of that kind of education and MFAs and so on.
Yes.
Is there a difference then in their process? Is there an overlap, or is that something for a later session?
That's a very, very good question. And afterwards, I'm going to write that down. Come up and ask me again so I don't forget it. The question was, is there a difference between the processes of people that have been highly trained as artists and people who are self-taught as artists? And I'm going to wing it here because I'm thinking as I'm talking. But as I recall, no. But I think there's a reason for that. I went to the Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa, and I went to the nonfiction workshop, which was fairly structured. But a lot of the students in that workshop had already gone through the poetry or the fiction workshop. And I asked one of them about his experience in the poetry workshop, and he said, that workshop has ruined more good poets than it made. Because he said I've seen people who are really, really good, but the amount of criticism and the amount of anxiety involved in showing your work to these other people, only the strong survive. And he said there are a lot of them that don't write anymore. And he said it is criminal. He was really very upset about it. Fortunately, my program was more structured. We had classes, we had homework, we had things that prevented that kind of, and I think that, the glory programs were the poetry and fiction programs. Nobody really paid attention to us, so we were all collegial and helped one another out. But that was really, and I heard that from several other people later. So I think, to some extent, the people whose work you end up seeing when you look at a national pool and pick the best are the people who were strong enough that, in spite of their education, as well as because of it, listened to their gut, did the things they were passionate about, refused to be told no. We all know people like that. And I think that's the work we're seeing. I think the people who did everything just the way their teacher told them to don't end up in museums. Yeah.
Isn't there a bit of rebel in these people, in that they took their own road?
Isn't there a bit of rebel in these people that they took their own road? Very good point. Yes?
The first person you talked about, Mr. Carpenter.
Yes.
He apparently created some new techniques. Are they willing to teach others?
Yes, he teaches. He teaches. Yeah. The question was, Galen Carpenter, the guy who made the segmented wood bowls, or segmented bowls out of lots of materials, does he share his techniques with others? Yes, and he was very generous. And when I asked him about it, he told me, okay, you have this many pieces, you have a 22.5-degree angle, this is what you have to do, and he now does some teaching. They were all very generous about their process. I think because they realized what Carl Schrag said, and that is, teach others so that they can incorporate it and do their own thing with it, but nobody's going to do what they do because their style is their own. But that's a very good question. Any differences that you noticed in things that people did differently? We've identified a lot of themes. Are there any variations that some did differently than others that occurred. Yes?
The woodworker depended more on tradition, on Chinese tradition than the others.
Okay, the woodworker depended more on tradition than others. Although he seemed to come to it by his own path. I don't know that he'd actually seen the resemblance between his work and some of that other stuff until the Wichita Museum said, well, you're creating classically shaped vessels.
No,
Chinese.
The Chinese, oh, okay, yeah. Anybody else? Differences?
They worked in different media.
They worked in different media, yes.
That was exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Find
Yeah,
your own.
I'm sorry?
Find your own medium.
Find your own medium, yeah. Interestingly enough, that's one of the things that is amazing. The processes, we mentioned lots and lots of similarities in process, and yet the media are all different. So this says to me, trying to look at it a little bit scientifically, that if these same processes show up in different people who have never talked to one another in different media, we're learning something about the nature of creativity here as a result. To what extent did they seem to be conscious of their life-work connection? From what we know.
I don't understand the question.
Okay, I'll restate. To what extent did they seem to be conscious that things in their life were influencing their work? They're not. I've heard they're not. They're generally not conscious. Yeah, that was my perception also. That they readily saw it when you pointed it out, and it might seem obvious to somebody else. But they didn't start to say, well, you know, I love nature, I grew up with nature, and I want to make things that are alive that weren't. That only came to her after a day-long discussion where I was asking her, oh, I think somehow I've run out of, that's all right, I have paper. When all fails, dead trees. Okay. Another question, did they seem to have an identifiable style? Each one of them. Yes. Yeah, you could tell the things all looked of a piece, even though they were very different. There was another, when I gave this, a similar talk to another group. This was I was asked to talk about creativity to students in the design school at Iowa State University. And this is all 300 first-year students in the design school, and this is students that are going to go into architecture, interior design, graphic design, landscape design, product design. They all have to take a class their first year. That's because they say a lot of these kids come in with an idea that they want to be a graphic designer or an architect, but they really haven't thought more broadly about the creative options that they might have. And so we have this one class where we bring in people from the outside in various different creative professions to talk about what it is they do. And so I brought in my artists. And there was one woman in the audience who seemed extremely, I mean, she was just locked in on me the whole time. And afterwards, there was a group that wanted to talk to me afterwards, so we sat down, and she came, and she's about my age, in her late 50s. Her husband was with her. And she said, well, how do these people make this connection between the subconscious and so on? I said, well, let's talk a little bit, let's see. Because she seemed like she had something going on, and she said, and I said, well, what are you? And she said, well, I'm a first-year interior design student. And I said, oh, you know, have you had any experience with it? And she said, well, yes, I've designed several houses that have appeared in Better Homes and Gardens, and I kind of work as an interior designer. And I said, well, why are you here then? And she said, well, I've never really felt like a real interior designer, and I wanted the credential. And I said, well, what more credential do you need? I said, there are thousands of interior designers. I was on staff at these magazines. I saw how many people we considered and rejected, and you've had how many in it? And I said, why did you want to be an interior designer? And she burst into tears. And she said, I don't have to go to therapy. And she was very serious, and she took her a while to get her grip. And she said, when I was young, she was from apparently a very deeply dysfunctional family that had no money and very tumultuous relationships and very, very, very rough home life. And to help her parents survive financially, she took a job when she was a little girl in 5th or 6th grade, delivering the Shopper, you know, the free newspaper that gets handed out. And so she said, every day I would go out at dusk after doing my homework. and I'd come up to these people's front porches to drop the shopper, and I'd look through the window, and there was a family sitting at their dining table, you know, eating and talking, and, you know, there was wallpaper on the walls, and there was lots of food. And she said, after one night, I put all of the shoppers in the closet of my bedroom, and every week when the guy would come around to give me shoppers, I put the bags in the closet. I couldn't bear to go out and see those happy families over and over again. And she says, and so that's what I'm doing. I'm creating that space that I didn't have when I was young. And she hadn't realized that until I just started asking her what seemed to me to be very obvious questions. So I think we've all got this kind of experience in us. How much time do we have left? 15 minutes, okay. So next time, we're going to get into the real, we've heard some kind of wooga stuff today. The next time we're going to get into what I think is the real question, and that is, where does creativity come from? Is it something that we have to wait for it to visit us? Is it something that has to come out of our subconscious and tap us on the shoulder and hold our hand while we draw things? Or is it something that we can summon on our demand? In other words, can you be a pro and be creative? I mean, I think of a professional as somebody, I mean, an amateur on a good day, an amateur vocalist can sing a good song if everything's, you know, all the stars are aligned. An amateur woodworker can produce something that's really pretty. An amateur athlete can, you know, hit a home run. But a pro is somebody who can do it on demand all the time. Is there such a thing as a professional artist in that sense? Or do they just have to wait for the muse? I remember reading, I was not encouraged when I first started investing. And of course, I have a very personal reason for wanting to know this. I mean, I wanted to be a writer when I was a kid, and I wanted to know, how do they do it? How do you know if you're a writer? Can you be it professionally? Or am I just going to be sitting and waiting to be inspired? What is inspiration? And so my favorite writer was John McPhee, who is a profile writer for the New Yorker magazine. And he is tremendously prolific. He used to turn out about a book a year for decades. I mean, all the time. So I thought, well, this guy's a pro. This guy, you know, this guy is just, he's in the catbird seat. He works for the New Yorker. He brings out a book a year, you know, regular as clockwork. And so I started reading some of his writings on writing. And he said the first piece that he wrote, he spent 2 weeks lying on a picnic table in his backyard, staring up at the sky, trying to come up with a way to begin. And he no longer has to do that. But how he got from that point to being able to sit down and write was what I really wanted to know. So next time, what I want you to think about, meanwhile, maybe we can have a little bit of a conversation about it now. Do you think creative people can be creative on demand, or is it something they have to wait for? Any thoughts?
Sure, they can be creative on demand.
They can.
Musicians do it all the time.
Okay, yeah, musicians do it all the time. Jazz, they improvise, jazz musicians improvise.
It's like the same song every night differently.
Same song every night differently. So yeah, we have one vote for yes. The question, the statement was, yes, people can be creative on demand. Look at jazz musicians, they can play the same song every night, but play it differently. Yes?
Doesn't it have something to do with right brain and left brain?
Ah, very interesting. So the comment was, does it have something to do with left brain and right brain? You know, probably Betty Edwards is the most famous person to talk about this, drawing on the right side of the brain, where, you know, the left, I can't remember because I'm mildly dyslexic, I think, but the left side of the brain is the logical, rational side, and the right side of the brain is the sort of more emotional shapes, colors, that sort of thing. And does this have to do with sort of short-circuiting that? And is the right side of the brain the subconscious? I mean, I think that's another question. Very, very good question. Think about that as well. Anybody else? Yes?
My personal experience was I worked for quite a few years in a very left-brain job.
Yeah.
And then when I was suddenly retired, I decided I wanted to be an artist. I had dabbled a little bit before. And so I went about doing exactly what you're saying, which is reading about and studying how to be creative. And I think you can do it. You can go from, you know, thinking very rationally to thinking more artistically, if you work at it.
The personal experience speaking here, had a very technical left brain job, and decided on retirement that she wanted to be an artist, and she said she studied up on it, read about it, and she said, yeah, I think you can make the leap. And certainly the experience of these people that we saw today seemed to indicate that.
Are you familiar with The Artist's Way, the book?
I had heard of it, yes, yes, I haven't read it.
I did that. It's a 12-week thing where you work on it yourself.
A book called The Artist's Way, where you work on it yourself. I did read Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, and I did do the exercises in that, and it's astounding what you can produce. Yeah. Now, another question is, can what we learn about creativity from these people be applied to life in general? I mean, we talked about them applying it specifically to creative products. But is there something about their mindset and the way they work and the way they look at things and the way they dip in and out of their subconscious that is useful to people in everyday life, that's useful to us in doing what we do? Any thoughts about that? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes. Because?
I think it's real important to find that zen as often as you can, a time to have great focus and work on producing something or solving a problem, or also looking at something in a different way, to get outside the box.
The comment was, yes, she thinks it's very important to get into that Zen state where you have a terrific focus, to get outside the box, to look at something in a different way, to come up with a creative solution. Anybody else? Yes?
I think you have to set aside time and create a routine that makes it possible. You know, okay, every morning I'm going to spend 2 hours doing this or that, and that becomes a routine. You sit down and, you know, Zen plays a part of it. You know, you focus on what it is you want to create, what you want to accomplish.
Yeah, the comment was, you know, if you want to do this, you can very deliberately set about putting yourself in that mindset, setting aside some time when there aren't distractions, when you can focus on one thing. Yeah, good point. Anybody else? All right. Well, I also brought a couple things with me today, thanks to the generosity of my publisher. I have 2 copies of the Iowan magazine because I actually have 120 copies of 2 different issues of the Iowa magazine because Joanne said she wanted me to hold it up and show the magazine that I edited. This is it. We also interview artists fairly regularly in the magazine, and somebody else came up to me last week and said, can I access these articles that you've written about these artists? And I said, well, they're all 20, 25-year-old magazines now. They're probably hard to get to. But there are some articles about artists here. I didn't write them, but I encouraged people to ask the kinds of questions that we've asked here. So I think you might find them interesting. So as you leave, you can pick up one per person. We only have enough for one per person. But whichever one you pick up, feel free to take it home, read it. When you bring it back, if you bring it back next time, you can swap with somebody who had the other magazine. There's 60 copies of each, so that you can get to read both of them. And okay, which artist is it? Which one? In this magazine, on page 48, there is a story about, and if you order before midnight tonight, there's a story about a woman I called Iowa's best artist you've never heard of. This is Hilda Jeroen. She is from Belgium, and she does some beautiful, beautiful ceramic art, and she's also done a lot of public art around Iowa. She has some very interesting things to say about art, including that there's an element that appears in every one of her pieces of art, and she has no idea why it's there. This magazine, the guy on the front is Bob Dorr. Has anybody heard of Bob Dorr? Okay, Bob Dorr is the head guy, the front guy for the Blue Band, which is a very popular and has been around for 35 years, playing the blues around Iowa. He's played in Grinnell here just recently, actually. He also has 3 radio shows on IPR, Backtracks, Blues Medley, or Beatles Medley, and what's the other one? Blue Highway, right. So you hear him saying, he's the guy with a really deep voice who says, this is Bob Dorr driving the blues bus down Blue Avenue. But anyway, he's a musician, he's a producer, and he's a very, very interesting guy who's been at it for a long time. So I think you'll find both of those things interesting. Again, if you have any questions for me, I'll hang around for a little bit, but feel free to send me an email, Dan W. Weeks danwreads2ws@gmail.com. Thanks so much for coming. You can pick up the magazines right up as you need, right up front.
And we thank you very much, Dan, too, and we thank you to your publisher for giving us copies of it. And as Dan mentioned, take whatever copy you want, and then next week bring it back and exchange it for the other copy. And we will have them on Nisha's table out in front when you come back next week. Thank you for coming.
Close your ears because you can't hear this, but there are subscription cards in those magazines.
I didn't hear a thing. Thank you, we'll see you next week.
Yeah.